The morning I found out what my sister had been planning, I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen making coffee in the same percolator Eleanor had used for 40 years. I'm Holly, and I'm 34 years old, and I teach third grade at a public elementary school 12 minutes from the Victorian house I now legally own. The percolator is copper-bottomed and slightly dented on one side from a fall it took sometime in the 90s, and Eleanor never replaced it because she said things that still work didn't need to be replaced. I think about that a lot now. The call came from my mother at 7:43 in the morning. She had the specific tone she uses when she has rehearsed something and is delivering it as though she hasn't measured warm at the surface, with a particular careful structure underneath. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, "about the house." My grandmother had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since I had driven her to her last appointment. 6 weeks since I had sat beside her in the room that smelled like lavender and old wood while she told me, in her unhurried way, that she wasn't afraid. 6 weeks since Mr. Patterson had read the will in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, and my sister Madison had gone very still in the chair beside me. Eleanor had left the house to me. All of it. The Victorian on Cedarwood Lane with the wraparound porch and the stained glass panel above the front door, and the garden she'd tended since before I was born. $750,000 of real estate, by the most recent appraisal, left entirely to the granddaughter who had spent 5 years driving her to chemotherapy and managing her medications and sleeping in the guest room on the difficult nights. My mother said, "We think the right thing, the fair thing, would be for you to sell it to Madison." I set down my coffee cup very carefully on the counter. "For how much?" I said. $250,000, she said. "She's family, Holly. It shouldn't be about market value." Something went quiet in me in that moment. Not the numb quiet of shock. I had been bracing for something since the reading of the will, watching Madison's stillness, watching the way my parents had exchanged a look across the lawyer's office that I'd filed away without examining. This was a different quiet. The quiet of a woman who realizes she has been standing at the edge of something without knowing it, and has just looked down. I told my mother I would think about it. I hung up and stood in Eleanor's kitchen for a long time, with the percolator breathing steam beside me, and the morning light coming through the window above the sink at the angle I knew better than any other light in the world. I was 34 years old and I had just been asked to give away $500,000 to a sister who had not once visited our grandmother in the last 2 years of her life. Thought no. And then I thought, but I need to understand exactly what I'm saying no to. Let me tell you about Eleanor first, because without Eleanor none of the rest of it makes sense. She was 81 when she died, and she had been a particular kind of woman. Not soft exactly, but deeply warm, with a precision of observation that she delivered gently, without cruelty. She had grown up in this house. Her late husband had renovated it 3 times over 40 years, each renovation careful and considered. Nothing stripped away that didn't need to be. The wraparound porch was his addition. The garden was hers. I started spending real time there when I was 29, newly out of a relationship that had taken more from me than I'd admitted, teaching third grade and feeling, in the specific way of people who haven't yet learned to name what they're missing, slightly unmoored. Eleanor had called me on a Sunday and said she needed help with some paperwork. The paperwork took an afternoon. I stayed for dinner. I came back the following weekend. By the time the cancer arrived, formally with a diagnosis and a treatment plan, I was already part of the rhythm of her life. I was the one who drove her. I was the one who organized the medications in the plastic weekly container, each compartment labeled in her handwriting until her handwriting became difficult, and then in mine. I was the one who slept in the guest room on the nights her pain spiked and she couldn't manage the stairs alone. I did not do this for the house. I want to be clear about that because the story could be told in a way that makes it seem transactional, and it wasn't. I did it because Eleanor was the person who had always seen me most clearly, who had asked real questions about my life and listened to the answers and remembered them the following week. In a family where I had spent most of my life feeling like the supporting cast in my sister's story, Eleanor had always made me feel like the main character of my own. When Mr. Patterson read the will, I was genuinely surprised. Not that she'd left me something, she'd mentioned it vaguely once in the way of old people who want to make sure you know they've thought about you. But the house. The whole house. I hadn't expected that. Madison's stillness in the chair beside me had lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she'd smiled, the particular smile she has, the one that doesn't reach her eyes, and said, Well, this is a lot to take in. Looking back at that smile now, I understand it was the smile of someone who had already begun planning. Not the surprise it presented itself as the considered expression of a person who has just received information they need to process strategically. I had known Madison my whole life and I had seen that smile before. I had just never understood what it meant. I hadn't asked what she meant by a lot to take in. I had put my hand on her arm briefly and said it was a hard day for everyone. That was my first mistake. In the weeks after the funeral, I moved into the house. It wasn't a dramatic decision, more a practical one made in increments. My apartment lease was ending. The house was there, and it needed someone in it, and I knew every room the way you know a place where you've spent significant time in significant moments. I packed my things over a weekend in late October, drove them in 3 carloads, and stood in the front hallway of 14, Cedarwood Lane with the stained glass panel throwing colored light across the floor and felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like arrival. Like the house and I had been moving toward each other for 5 years and had finally gotten there. I went back to school on a Monday. 3rd graders don't give you much space for existential processing, which is, I've found, one of the genuine gifts of the profession. You walk into a classroom at 8 in the morning with 23 small humans who need to learn long division, and the world narrows to the right size. I was grateful for that in the weeks after Eleanor died in a way I hadn't expected to be. My colleagues were kind. My classroom aide, a woman in her 50s named Brenda who had worked with 3 previous teachers and had strong opinions about everything, brought me soup one afternoon without explanation and said nothing about it, which was exactly right. The pressure from my family, meanwhile, was building in the patient, incremental way of water finding cracks. My mother called every 3 or 4 days. The calls had a consistent structure: general warmth, inquiry about how I was settling in, and then, toward the end, always toward the end, a variation on the theme she'd introduced that first morning. The house was very large for one person. Madison had always loved it. The family should be able to benefit. Had Holly given more thought to what was fair? I gave measured answers. I said I was still processing. I said it had only been a few weeks. I said I understood there were feelings involved and I wanted to navigate them carefully. All of which was true. None of which was my actual position. I had already decided I wasn't selling, but I hadn't yet said it clearly, and I spent some time afterward wondering why. I think the honest answer is that I was still, at 34, operating from a pattern I'd developed as a child. Manage the surface, keep the temperature down by time. I had learned very early that direct disagreement with my mother cost more than deferred disagreement, and so I had become skilled at the latter. The problem with that skill is that it delays things without resolving them, and sometimes what gets delayed becomes larger in the interval. Madison called once in that first month. Just once, which I noted. The call was brief. She asked how I was, said the house must bring up complicated feelings, asked if I'd had a chance to look at the estate documents carefully. I said I had. She said she was sure we'd figure everything out as a family. She hung up before I could respond. That phrasing, figure everything out as a family, had a particular texture. I replayed it several times. It was the language of someone framing a negotiation as a shared project, as something we were working on together rather than something being done to me. I filed it away. My colleague Jonathan, who taught 5th grade across the hall and had the particular quality of being reliably present without being intrusive, noticed something was off at the end of my 2nd week back. He said nothing directly, which I appreciated. He simply appeared in my classroom doorway at the end of a Thursday with 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the break room, and said he had 20 minutes if I wanted company. I told him the broad outline. Not the numbers, those felt too specific, too raw, but the shape of it. Family pressure about the inheritance. Sister who wanted the house. Parents who had aligned themselves accordingly. Jonathan listened the way good people listen, without hurry, without the itch to fix things before you finish speaking. What does your gut tell you? He said. That the number they named isn't the real issue, I said. The number is too specific. Too obviously unfair. It's a placeholder for something else. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. What's the something else? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question stayed with me. Aunt Carol called in mid-November. Carol was my father's sister, warm, somewhat peripheral to the main drama of our family, given to long phone calls about her garden and her grandchildren and the particular politics of her neighborhood association. She called occasionally, always meaning well, always slightly behind on developments. I heard about Eleanor's house, she said. Your mother mentioned Madison is hoping to buy it from you. Yes, I said carefully. Is that what you want? A pause before I answered. I'm still thinking. Your grandmother told me once, Carol said in a different tone, slower, more deliberate, that she'd decided something about that house a long time ago. She said she wanted it to go to the right person. Did she say who that was? She said she already knew. Carol moved on to her garden before I could press further, and I let her, because I understood that she had told me what she intended to tell me and the rest wasn't hers to give. But the information settled in my mind alongside everything else. Eleanor had known. She had thought about it. The will wasn't a spontaneous decision or a final week's impulse. It was a considered one, made over time with the deliberation she brought to everything. Which meant my family's request wasn't just unfair. It was asking me to undo something Eleanor had chosen with intention. That was the moment the emotional question became a different kind of question entirely. I had been asking myself, what do I owe my family? What does fairness look like? How do I honor everyone involved? I should have been asking, what did Eleanor intend and why? The pressure shifted in December. It didn't escalate dramatically. There was no single scene, no raised voices, no ultimatum delivered with the door open. It was more like a change in the weather. The calls came more frequently. My father began calling in addition to my mother, which was unusual. He was a man who communicated primarily through my mother's reports, and his independent contact meant the effort had been organized and I was now its target. He had a different approach than my mother. Where she used warmth and appeals to fairness, he used a kind of compressed practicality. The house was a lot of responsibility, wasn't it? A teacher's salary managing a Victorian? Had I thought about the upkeep costs? Madison had resources that would allow her to maintain it properly. The implication, never stated directly, was that I wasn't the right person for it. That my ownership was a misallocation of the asset, regardless of what Eleanor had wanted. I remember sitting with that implication for a long time one evening, really sitting with it, turning it over, trying to determine whether there was any honest part of me that believed it. There wasn't. I had managed that house through its owner's final years. I knew where the boiler's fault was, where the garden needed shoring up before spring, which window stuck in humidity and how to release it. The suggestion that I couldn't manage it was not a practical observation. It was a narrative, constructed to make me doubt myself just enough to agree. I started keeping notes. Not a formal document, just a running record on my phone, dated entries of each call, each conversation, each thing said that felt worth remembering. I didn't know yet why I was doing it. Some combination of the instinct that had made me document Eleanor's medical appointments so carefully, and the quiet understanding that things were building towards something I needed to be prepared for. In one of those notes I wrote, Dad mentioned Madison's resources twice in one call. Why is her financial position relevant to a conversation about my inheritance? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question sharpened something. Madison came to the house in mid-December. She called first, a courtesy I noticed because it was out of character. Madison typically arrived at things, she didn't request entry to them. She showed up at the door on a Saturday afternoon in a coat I recognized as expensive and stood on the porch looking at the wraparound railing with an expression I couldn't fully read. It looks exactly the same, she said. I haven't changed anything, I said. She came in and walked through the ground floor in a way that was slightly too deliberate to be casual, pausing at doorways, touching the frame of Eleanor's sideboard, standing for a moment in the kitchen with her head slightly tilted. She wasn't visiting. She was assessing. I offered tea. She accepted. We sat at the kitchen table in the way of two people who have known each other their whole lives and are currently strangers. I want you to know, Madison said, that I understand this is hard. Losing her was hard for all of us. I said nothing. Waited. But the house, Holly, you have to see that it should stay in the family. In a real way. Not just legally. I own it legally, I said. That's not a technicality. She looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has decided to be more generous than the situation strictly requires. Of course. But $250,000 is real money. You could pay off your apartment. Oh, you're living here now. You could invest it. Buy something more your size. More your size. I held those 3 words in my mind while I kept my face neutral. I'll think about it, I said. She left an hour later. I stood at the front door and watched her car pull away from the curb, and I thought about the way she'd moved through the rooms. Not like someone who loved the house, like someone who was calculating its value per square foot. Looking back at that afternoon, I should have trusted what I saw. She hadn't come to visit. She had come to look at what she intended to acquire. The affection she performed over tea was genuine enough in its way. Madison was not a person without feeling, but the visit had a purpose that the feeling was decorating, not driving. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I had been telling myself that about Madison for 30 years. The first week of January, Linda Torres called me. Linda was a real estate attorney I'd been referred to by a colleague. I'd called her in December vaguely, telling myself I just wanted to understand my options, telling myself I wasn't planning anything specifically. She was brisk and specific and had, in our first conversation, asked 4 questions that made me realize I had not been thinking about this situation with enough precision. I've been looking into the property, she said, and I found something you should know about. She told me that Madison's company, a commercial development consultancy I'd known she worked for, but had never thought much about, had been in discussions with a developer about properties in the Cedarwood Lane neighborhood. The area was in the early stages of a rezoning process that would, if completed, significantly increase the value of certain properties for mixed-use development. The house at number 14, Linda said, was specifically on a list of properties the development group had flagged as desirable acquisitions. I sat very still. Madison works for the company involved? I said. She's a senior associate, Linda said. She wouldn't be the decision-maker on acquisitions, but she would have access to the pipeline. I thought about the way Madison had moved through the rooms, the way she'd stood in the kitchen with her head tilted. The specific number, 250,000, that was low enough to be an insult but high enough to sound like a gesture. She hadn't been trying to buy Eleanor's house because she loved it. She had been trying to acquire an asset that her company wanted, at a price that would give her a significant professional advantage, using family pressure as leverage to get it below market value. That was the moment everything reorganized. Not just the present situation, the years behind it too. The pattern of my sister always being given things I earned. The parents who had never once asked why Madison deserved more. The accumulated small erasures of my effort, my care, my presence. It hadn't been about love or fairness. It had been about a system that allocated resources to the person who was better at demanding them, and I had spent my whole life being too careful, too patient, too committed to keeping the peace to demand anything at all. I understood then something I hadn't articulated before. I wasn't afraid of losing my family. I was afraid of what it would mean about my worth if I stood my ground and they disowned me anyway. The threat of disownment had power because it asked the question, are you worth fighting for? And I had never been fully sure of the answer. I was sure now. I spent the next 3 weeks being very quiet and very busy. Linda and I met twice in her office, a clean, spare space that smelled like good coffee, and had a window overlooking a parking structure that she seemed not to notice. She had a way of presenting information that I recognized from the best teachers I'd had. She gave you the fact, the implication, and the question, and let you work with them in that order. The rezoning process, she explained, was not yet public. It was in a preliminary consultation stage, the kind of thing that showed up in municipal planning documents that almost no one read. Madison's company had clearly been tracking it. The development group they were working with had acquisition targets, and 14 Cedarwood Lane was one of them. At full development value after rezoning, the property could be worth significantly more than the current appraisal. Linda estimated somewhere between $900,000 and just over $1 million, depending on how the process resolved. Madison had known this. She had been trying to acquire a potential $1 million asset for $250,000, using family obligation as the mechanism. What are my options? I said. Linda put her hands flat on the desk and looked at me with the direct expression of someone who has done this long enough to know when a client is ready to hear things clearly. You could sell at full market value to any buyer, she said. That would likely attract the development group directly. Or you could structure a sale with a leaseback agreement. Sell the property at current market value, retain the right to live there for a defined period at a fixed rent, and convert the equity into liquid assets while maintaining your home. Who would buy under those terms? A commercial buyer who wants the asset and is willing to wait for occupancy, she said. Particularly if the rezoning comes through. They'd be acquiring the property at a price that accounts for current value, with future upside. For them, a leaseback is a small cost for a clean acquisition. I looked at the window overlooking the parking structure. Are there buyers in that category? I said. I've already had a preliminary conversation with one, Linda said. A firm called Mercer and Associates. They're a regional commercial real estate group with a clean record and patient capital. They're very interested. Something settled in me at that moment that I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph, it was too early for triumph, and I was too careful a person for that kind of anticipation. More like the particular calm of someone who has found solid ground after a long time in uncertain footing. I had spent the previous weeks feeling the pressure from every direction. My parents, my sister, the accumulated weight of 30 years of being the one who accommodates. And here, in Linda's spare office with its view of a parking structure, was a path that required me to be none of those things. My parents escalated in February. My father called on a Tuesday evening with a different tone than his previous calls. Less the compressed practicality, more something harder underneath it. He said they had been patient. He said the situation was becoming difficult for the family. He said if I couldn't see my way to doing the right thing, there would be consequences for our relationship. It was finally the actual threat. I let him finish. Then I said very calmly, Dad, I need you to understand that I'm not going to sell the house to Madison. I'm going to handle the property in a way that reflects its actual value and honors what Eleanor intended. If that affects our relationship, I'm sorry about that. But the decision is made. A silence. The particular silence of someone who has deployed the final threat and discovered it has landed differently than expected. You choose a house over your family, he said. I choose what Eleanor gave me over a scheme I'm not willing to participate in, I said. He hung up. My mother called the following morning. Her voice had a different quality than any previous call. The careful warmth was gone, replaced by something rawer, less managed. She said she couldn't understand what had happened to me. She said Madison was devastated. She said Holly had always been the difficult one, the one who couldn't just be part of the family. The difficult one. I had heard that characterization my whole life in various forms, and it had always landed somewhere tender. It landed differently now. I had not been difficult. I had been the one who cared for Eleanor for 5 years while Madison built her career. I had been the one who was present. The characterization of my independence as difficulty was a story my family had told to avoid examining what my compliance had always cost me. I love you, I said to my mother. And I've made my decision. I ended the call and sat in Eleanor's kitchen for a long time. Then I called Linda and told her to proceed with Mercer and Associates. Madison called that same week. The call came on a Thursday evening, and her voice had lost the managed warmth of December. What was underneath it was something I recognized, the specific register of a person who has just realized a plan has failed and is recalculating. You know what you're doing, she said. I do, I said. You're going to sell to a developer. The neighborhood is going to change. Eleanor would have hated that. I thought about Eleanor, about her precision, her deliberateness, the way she made decisions. About Aunt Carol's words. The right person. Eleanor left the house to me, I said. She trusted me to decide what to do with it. I'm deciding. You're being vindictive, Madison said. This is about punishing me. Something interesting happened in that moment. I felt nothing. Not the flare of anger I might have expected. Not the guilt that the accusation was designed to produce. Just a kind of clarity, the recognition that the accusation was a last maneuver rather than a real statement. Madison didn't actually believe I was acting from vindictiveness. She was naming the worst interpretation of my motives because it was the only leverage left. No, I said. It isn't. Good night, Madison. I put the phone down and went to look at the garden through the kitchen window. The winter had been mild. There were things starting to come up at the edges that Eleanor would have been pleased about. The meeting happened in March. My parents had requested, through my mother's third call of that week, a family gathering. Neutral ground, she said. Their house Sunday lunch, just the 4 of us. I said yes because I had decided that this conversation needed to happen in person with the full information present, and because I was ready for it. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday with a folder on the passenger seat and a specific kind of quiet in my chest. Not calm exactly, but resolved. The difference between the two is important. Calm is the absence of anxiety. Resolve is the presence of clarity in spite of it. Madison was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee, and when I came in she looked at me with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. My mother had made lunch. The table was set carefully, the particular care she puts into surfaces when she wants a gathering to appear normal. My father stood by the window and said hello in the tone of a man who has been briefed. We ate. The conversation was careful, slightly elevated, for people managing the surface of something that was directly underneath all of us. I let them do it. I ate and answered questions and waited. After lunch, my father set down his fork and said, "We should talk about the house." "Yes," I said. "We should." I opened the folder. What I had assembled, with Linda's help, was not a confrontational document. It was a factual one: the rezoning timeline, the development group's acquisition interest, Madison's company's role in that process, the discrepancy between the $250,000 offer and the property's actual and projected value. I had also included Eleanor's will, the full text, with the paragraph about her reasons clearly visible. I laid it on the table and let them look. My mother's eyes moved across the pages with an expression I watched carefully, the particular movement of someone reading information they half knew and were hoping wasn't as clear as it looked. My father's jaw tightened. Madison looked at the table rather than the documents. "You knew about the rezoning," I said to Madison. "Not an accusation. A statement." She didn't deny it. She lifted her eyes from the table and looked at me with something that was not quite defiance and not quite shame, somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "It's business," she said. "It's our grandmother's house," I said. "And you were going to buy it for a third of its value using our parents as leverage." "You always do this," my mother said, in a tone that had nothing to do with the documents on the table. "You always make yourself the victim." There it was. The move I had been expecting, the move I had spent 30 years absorbing, the reframing of my clarity as self-pity, my documentation as dramatics, my standing my ground as victimhood. It had always worked before because I had been uncertain enough about my own perceptions to second-guess them when challenged. I was not uncertain now. "I'm not the victim," I said. "I'm the person who has the deed." My father said something about family loyalty. My mother said something about how this wasn't what Eleanor would have wanted. Madison said nothing, which was, I thought, the most honest response in the room. I let them speak. When they finished, I said, "I've signed a sale agreement with Mercer and Associates. Full market value. I retain residency for 5 years through a leaseback arrangement. The transaction closes in 6 weeks." The silence that followed had a very specific quality, the silence of a plan that has been running for months encountering a single irrevocable fact. My mother said, "You can't." "It's already done," I said. Madison stood up. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair and she looked at me across the table with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the polished performance of her public self, and not the cold calculation I'd seen at Christmas. Something more elemental than either. Closer to grief, almost, though I wasn't sure what exactly she was grieving. "I did care about the house," she said. "You should know that. It wasn't only business." I looked at her for a moment. "I know," I said. "But you chose business anyway." She left without another word. My parents stayed seated. My mother was crying, quietly, in the way of people who cry from frustration rather than sorrow. My father had the expression of a man who has just realized that the sequence of events had a different logic than the one he'd been operating with. I gathered my folder and stood up. "I love you both," I said. "That hasn't changed. But I'm not going to be managed. Not about this, not about anything." I drove home in the late afternoon light, along streets that were just beginning to soften toward spring, and I felt, for the first time in months, the particular lightness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally been able to set it down. The sale closed on a Tuesday in April. I sat in Linda's office while the paperwork moved through its final stages, signing where indicated, reading what I was signing with the careful attention Eleanor had always modeled for any document that mattered. The leaseback agreement was clean and specific. 5 years at a fixed monthly rent that was well below market rate, with an option to extend by mutual agreement. Mercer and Associates got the asset. I kept the home. Linda shook my hand when it was done. She had a way of marking the end of things without ceremony, a brief, genuine acknowledgement and then the forward movement. I appreciated that. Walking out into the April afternoon, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and did nothing. Just stood there in the light. The folder with the documents was in my bag. The house on Cedarwood Lane was no longer technically mine, but I would wake up in it tomorrow morning and make coffee in Eleanor's percolator and look out the window above the sink at the garden she'd tended for 40 years. Some things change their form without losing their substance. My mother called 3 weeks after the closing. The call was different in texture from any previous one, shorter, more tentative, with none of the engineered warmth she usually deployed. She asked how I was. She asked about school. Near the end of the call, in the careful tone of someone placing something fragile on a surface, she said, "I think we handled things badly." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to do better." "I know," I said. "I'd like that too." We talked for another few minutes about ordinary things. Her garden, my classroom, a trip she and my father were planning. It was tentative and slightly awkward and genuinely meant on both sides, which made it more valuable than most of the conversations we'd had in the previous 6 months. I did not bring up Madison. My mother did not either. That conversation would come, eventually, in its own time, or it wouldn't. I had stopped requiring it. Aunt Carol came for tea in May. She sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, my kitchen table, for the duration of the leaseback at least, and looked around the room with the soft expression of someone visiting a place they love. "She would be pleased," Carol said. "I think so," I said. "She knew," Carol said, "about Madison's company, about the rezoning. One of her neighbors mentioned it to her, near the end. She called me about it." I set down my cup. "She knew. She changed the will shortly after," Carol said simply. "The previous version left the house to both of you equally. She changed it because she understood what equal ownership would mean, under those circumstances." I sat with that for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window the way it always did at this hour, landing on the floor in the familiar pattern. Eleanor hadn't just left me the house because I'd been there. She'd left it to me because she'd understood what was being planned, and she'd made a deliberate decision to protect something she valued from being used for something she hadn't intended. The right person. She had known all along. I teach 3rd grade in the same school I've taught in for 6 years. My classroom has a bookshelf that takes up most of one wall, organized by the students each year in a system they negotiate collectively, which is always different and always somehow works. Jonathan is still across the hall. Brenda still brings soup without explanation on the days she determines soup is needed, which remains one of the more reliable things in my life. Madison and I have spoken twice since March. Both conversations were brief, both civil, both slightly careful in the way of people who have been through something and are testing what, if anything, remains on the other side of it. There is something there, not what it was, not what it should have been, but something. I tend it carefully at a distance without expectation. My parents and I talk regularly now. The relationship has a different texture than before. Something more honest in it. Less performance, less management. My father has begun asking real questions about the house, about how things are going, and I answer them directly. My mother and I had one long conversation in June about favoritism, a real conversation, not a managed one, with silences and corrections and a moment when she cried in a way that felt genuine rather than tactical. I don't know what will grow from that conversation. I'm not managing my expectations of it. The East Garden came up beautifully this spring. I followed Eleanor's notes. She had kept a garden journal for 20 years, entries in her handwriting organized by season and plant, and the heirloom roses she'd put in the year before her diagnosis came back strong, exactly where she said they would. I stood in the garden on a Saturday morning in June with soil on my hands and the particular quiet of early summer around me, and I thought about what the past year had taught me. I had learned that the people who love you conditionally will always find a condition you haven't met. I had learned that keeping the peace is not the same as maintaining a relationship. It's a way of postponing the relationship's actual test, indefinitely, until the test arrives anyway and you're less prepared for it than you would have been. I had learned that clarity and harshness are different things, and I had spent years confusing them. And I had learned, Sitting at that kitchen table with the documents laid flat, watching my family encounter information they couldn't revise, that there is a particular kind of strength that has nothing to do with confrontation or volume or winning. It's the strength of simply being clear about what happened, what matters, and what you will and will not do. Eleanor had it. I had been watching her practice it for 5 years without knowing that's what I was learning. The percolator was on the counter. The garden journal was on the shelf. The stained glass panel above the front door still threw colored light across the floor in the mornings. The same colors, the same angles, changed only by season. I was 34 years old and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. What this story exposes at its core is the mechanics of a particular kind of family system, one built around a single allocated hierarchy where one child is the recipient of resources, validation, and benefit of the doubt, and the other is the provider of accommodation, care, and quiet compliance. Holly had been the provider in that system her entire life. The 5 years she spent caring for Eleanor were not an aberration. They were the expression of a pattern that had been established decades earlier. She was the one who showed up. She was the one who stayed. She was, to use the system's own logic, the reliable one, and reliability, in a family organized around Madison's appetite, had been rewarded with invisibility rather than recognition. What makes the betrayal in this story structurally interesting is how it exposed something the family had never needed to examine while it was working, that their treatment of Holly was not love with some complications. It was a transaction. Holly provided reliability, care, compliance, and received in return the intermittent warmth of people who needed her functional. The moment she stopped being functional for their purposes, the transaction was called in. Madison's scheme was opportunistic, but it was also logical within the framework she'd always operated in. She had spent her whole life receiving things that Holly worked for, and the house was simply the largest version of that pattern. The difference was scale and documentation. For the first time, Holly had a piece of paper that said something was hers, unambiguously, legally, with Eleanor's deliberate signature on it. And the family's response was to immediately attempt to reframe her ownership as a problem to be solved. The detail that carries the most weight is Eleanor's final decision about the will. She had known about the rezoning, about Madison's company, about what equal ownership would have meant. And she had changed the document quietly, with precision, without drama. That choice, made by a dying woman who had watched her family for 81 years, was itself a form of analysis. Eleanor had assessed the situation and made a judgment about who could be trusted with what she'd built, and her judgment was correct. Holly's transformation across the story is not from weakness to strength. That framing would flatten it. She had always had the strength. She had been directing it toward the wrong target. 5 years of care for Eleanor had not been weakness. 30 years of family accommodation had not been weakness. They were strength applied with the wrong compass. What changed was the compass, not the capacity. The leaseback structure Holly negotiated is worth examining as a symbol beyond its practical function. She sold the asset, retained the home. She converted the financial exposure into liquid security, while maintaining continuity. It was structurally what she had been doing emotionally all along, holding the substance of something while releasing the form of it that was causing harm. She stopped holding the form of a family relationship built on accommodation, and kept the substance of the connections that were worth keeping. What the story ultimately reveals about family systems is that the person who accommodates most reliably is often the least protected. Holly's compliance had never generated safety. It had generated predictability, which the family had used as a planning assumption. The moment she introduced unpredictability, the moment she said no and meant it, the entire architecture that had been built around her accommodation began to shift. The point of no return was not the filing of the sale agreement. It was the moment Holly read Linda's information about the rezoning and understood not just what Madison had done, but what it revealed about the 30 years before it. Some knowledge cannot be unknown. Once you understand that the pattern was always there, you cannot continue as though it wasn't. What stays with me about Holly's story is something quiet, the image of Eleanor changing her will alone, knowing what she knew, trusting in a granddaughter who didn't yet know she was being trusted. That's the part that feels most true to me. Not the confrontation at the table, not the legal transaction, but the private act of an old woman who had spent 81 years watching people, who looked at her family clearly and made a decision based on what she actually saw rather than what she wished were true. How many of us have someone in our lives who sees us that clearly? Who trusts us with something real, not because we're perfect but because they've watched us show up year after year in the ways that matter. Holly had that. She almost gave it away to keep the peace. The house was never the point. Being seen was.